thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I'm going to go fairly quickly because I've got quite a lot of material to cover that I hope will be of some interest to you. I'm a GP by trade, so not a pathologist. I work up in the Welsh Valleys 1 day a week at the moment, and I'm a very new chair of council. Really, this is now my 6th day in office, so I'm really very, very new. So we're talking about equality and diversity, and of course, just to remind people and get everybody in the zone, these are the definitions of equality, ensuring that every individual has an equal opportunity to make the most of their lives and their talents. And diversity is about recognizing, respecting, and valuing the differences between people. I really rather like this way of looking at it. Equality is about making sure everyone is invited to the party, but inclusivity is about making sure everyone is invited to dance. I'm sure you'll have seen this little cartoon. I've actually initially only saw the first 2 little bits on the left-hand side of equality and equity. And you can see the little chap who starts on the same level as everybody else cannot see the match. If he's put on a higher stool, he can see the match. But then you move on to reality, which is what's actually happening. And in fact, somebody's dug him a little hole so that he's even further down. But liberation is getting rid of that fence altogether. So if we're talking about differential performance, we've known about it for years and years. And Open University's done quite a lot of research on this. It thinks from its research that about half of the attainment gap, which is the attainment gap between people who are trained locally in the UK and people whose primary medical qualification is from abroad, but also the gap between people who are trained in the UK who are of non-white origin and those who are of white origin. There's an attainment gap there, which is smaller, but is still there, certainly in general practice, maybe not in pathology, I'm not sure. But it is thought that, that ethnicity seems to be a proxy for about half of the attainment gap. And we don't really know why that's happening, because wherever you look, you find it. In medical training, you see it in undergraduate education as well as in postgraduate. Chris McManus, who is the psychometrician for the Royal College of Physicians for many years, together with KATH have done systematic reviews and meta-analysis of 23 reports and have found it to be a kind of ubiquitous problem. It doesn't matter whether you're looking at machine mark written assessments, practical clinical assessments, pass-fail outcomes only, it's there in every single type of assessment. And they concluded that these differences were widespread, they've been there for many, many years, and they can't really be dismissed as local or atypical problems. And this is their paper in the BMJ that talked about it. We're looking at over 22,000 UK trained doctors and the impact of ethnicity on their performance. And they estimated that there's a 2.5 times higher risk of failing an exam if you come from an ethnic minority than if you're a white doctor. So going back to the Open University, surveys have found that, that attainment gap is not attributable to variations in their ratings of their courses, you know, whether they liked what they were learning or not attributable to variations in their academic engagement, nor to variations in their approaches to studying, nor to variations in their conceptions of learning. And it concluded that it might have been a proxy for other factors that have yet to be identified. It's just not very clear what's causing it. We think that the problem is likely to be systemic. It may have its roots in school and school experiences and the concept of stereotype threat, which I'm very happy to talk about later if you wish. It may be due to family or social influences. These are all the things that people have postulated as being reasons behind the differential attainment gap. The psychometricians say that in postgraduate training it may be affected by differences between the PLAB standard and the standard of exit from medical schools, or may be affected by the quality of training offered as to whether or not it's appropriate for people who have had their primary medical qualification in another country. and of course that it may be affected by the actual structure of the Royal College exams. So for us in the Royal College of GPs, this led to a judicial review, in fact, in 2014 against the MRCGP exams. It was brought by BAPIO, which is the British Association of Physicians of Indian Origin, against the GMC and the RCGP. It felt that the CSA, the clinical skills assessment in particular, discriminated against international medical graduates and graduates of ethnic minority, candidates of ethnic minority origin, and that the college failed in its public sector equality duty. In fact, the outcome of this was that the case was dismissed by Justice Mitting, but he made some important recommendations. He said that the CSA was lawful and fair, but that the focus of where this attainment gap was coming should be mainly on doctors' training. And he asked for the RCGP to work with the deaneries to address the reasons for underperformance and to produce a strategic plan to address differential attainment. A year or two later, KATH Wolf undertook a programme of work commissioned by the GMC, in which they interviewed 96 trainees and 41 trainers. And it culminated in the publication of this document, which is still available on their website, Fair Training Pathways for All. It is really interesting, and you may want to have a look at it if you're interested in this. It explored the experience of undertaking postgraduate medical training from the point of view of trainees and trainers, and it tried to understand the nature and causes of differential attainment and identify some possible actions to change education and training pathways to make them fairer and to reduce differences. But sometimes you have to look at things through a different lens. And again, in about 2011, 2012, I set up in partnership with a couple of sociolinguists from King's College London to do a sociolinguistic analysis of videos from the MRCGP clinical skills assessment to see if there was something going on there that might account for differential attainment. So this is the next few slides are the sociolinguistic perspective of why some candidates may be struggling in UK exams. So the CSA is it's no longer in use actually because the pandemic stopped it in its tracks, and we're now using recorded consultations, but it looks as if we will be returning to a CSA-like but virtual form of clinical assessment. So it was 13 cases, each of 10 minutes, based on standardized simulated patients and GPs who were trained examiners sitting in the background and watching the consultation. Over the 10 years that it ran, we found very different pass rates for UK graduates and international medical graduates. We had a lot of difficulty working out how to standard set this exam. And moving from one system to another in 2010 accentuated the differential pass rates, which really sort of catalyzed the judicial review in 2014. Having a standardized exam limits what you can display and demonstrate, of course. The validity can be affected by efforts to maintain reliability. It seems to me the more reliable and standardized you try to make an exam, the less valid it can appear. And for us, it was a very high stakes exam because it was the exit exam for entry into British general practice. And if you failed it enough times, it meant that you couldn't have a career in general practice at all. So looking through that different lens with the sociolinguists, I had to learn a whole load of new terminology. It was almost like learning a different language in itself. We were led by Celia Roberts from King's with research associate Sarah Atkins, using this sort of software, which was just absolutely fascinating for somebody like me. We had 200 candidates who agreed to allow us to record and video their consultations actually during the exam. And with the software, you could look at the video of the exam, as you can see there, would be progressing in the top right-hand corner, and the dialogue transcription would then scroll through as the video progressed, and below it, you would actually see the voice and how the voice was being recorded when the tone went up and when it went down, whether it was loud, whether it was soft. And it was also possible to make notes in the left-hand box. This was a knowledge transfer partnership funded project with matched funding from the Academy of Royal Medical Colleges. So this next slide shows you the methods. In the end, of the 200 candidates, we ended up with 40 cases. We specifically picked cases where the candidates had not failed due to making a clinical error, but due to other things that had happened during the consultation. And we had a range of passing and failing candidates and a range of candidates of different ethnicities. In addition to that, we also looked at the paperwork of the exam. We looked at the case range, the diversity of the cases, the marking schedules. We looked at the actual marking of those 4 cases compared to what we could actually see on the video. And we had 4 feedback sessions with examiners as well to find out what they thought about the whole thing. We analysed the data using something called CLAN software. Sarah had to go to Belgium to learn how to use it. And it's a very neat method of mapping what actually happens during a consultation, how much time is spent in the data gathering, how much in clinical explanation, and how it is dotted through the whole consultation. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. We then also spent some time actually micro-analysing the talk, seeing who said what and when and how it was said. Then we analysed the discussion groups with examiners, and we examined the case and marking paperwork. So with the broad analysis, looking across the 40 cases, using something, again, a technique called corpus linguistics, which uses quantitative methods to identify the words and phrases that were used compared to data sets of everyday spoken English and everyday GP encounters. We also looked at the words and phrases different candidates used, where, for instance, international medical graduates using formulaic statements, which is what the examiners thought was happening. And then we mapped the structure of the cases, where failing candidates gathering data at the end of the consultation rather than the beginning, and so on. And we also looked at the amount of talk that was between the role player's patient and between the candidate, and interruptions that took place during the consultation. The micro-linguistic analysis was looking closely at turn-by-turn interaction to establish where things went well or where things went badly. So it's much more qualitative, whereas the macro-analysis was more quantitative. And what we found was that small moments could have quite large consequences for the consultation. So this slide shows you that mapping. Obviously, I don't expect you to read it, it's way too small, but it just shows you how Sarah went through each of those cases very laboriously, mapping every consultation to see what was happening where in the consultation. And what we found, as always, was that the devil was in the detail. When you looked at the macro analysis, there were no important differences between candidates in structure and pace, whether they were passing or whether they were failing. There were no obvious differences in the amount of talk or what phrases were used. Everybody used stereotypical formulaic phrases, whether they passed or whether they failed. It was really only when we came to the microanalysis that we started to see differences. And poorly performing candidates were more likely to have difficulties giving explanations. They were more likely to have misunderstandings in the consultation with their role player patient. They had more difficulty repairing those misunderstandings because, of course, all of us when we consult have misunderstandings with patients, but we can usually sort them out quickly and carry on more or less unimpeded. And they had more moments of misalignments with the patient that would impact on the unfolding consultation and sounded formulaic to the examiners. And often the reasons for failure appeared to be due to an accumulation of lots and lots of little micro level difficulties in communication rather than in macro. So this is a picture of some of the sort of gross mapping, which showed that where the data gathering here is in blue, the clinical explanation is in the peach color, And then the darker colour is the discussion with the patient at the end, and the shared management plan. And you would normally expect the data gathering to be in the beginning of the consultation, then the explanation, and then the management. But here you can see a candidate who's dotting around a bit and is doing data gathering really quite late into the consultation. And the feedback comments reflected that: poor time management, disorganized and unstructured consultations. Going back then to the microanalysis, we found that candidates who did well were more likely to align with patients, be on the same page as the patients, but also balance it with institutional requirements. They made the talk conversational with the patient, and they combined clear explanations with alignments to the patient's expectations and the patient's ideas, concerns, and expectations. And although they used the typical CSA phrases, they found ways of customizing them to avoid sounding as if they just read them out of a textbook. They communicated with fewer hesitations and false starts, although everybody did a bit of that. And they were able to do something that we call meta communication. So the examiner sitting in the background is listening. They're very aware that the examiner is there just behind their shoulder, and they were able to comment out loud on what they were doing in a way that appeared to fit with the consultation and with the role player, and convey what they were intending they were going to do to the examiner by doing it that way. Well, what about the role players then? Were they racist in some way? And they certainly played a powerful role in shaping the consultation. We could see that from all this analysis, but there was no evidence of discrimination in the consultations. And in fact, quite often the role players could save candidates rather than sinking them, but it didn't happen with any consistent pattern, and it didn't seem to depend on the background of the candidate or how well or how badly that they were doing. And role players tended to be the ones who highlighted misunderstandings in the consultation, but that's actually a factor of the assessment design and the nature of their role, rather than trying to be difficult. So this is just a bit of discourse, just to show you how you can end up sounding formulaic and a bit disastrous. And it's only a couple of sentences that are in bold at the bottom of this dialogue. So this is about a patient, a simulated patient, a woman in her mid to late 30s who's got menorrhagia and who's having such heavy periods that there are times when she floods. And she's a teacher, and she's finding it really embarrassing when she's flooding in class and blood is dripping down her leg. And she's telling the candidate about it. It hasn't happened, but I'm really worried it's going to, and you can't just run out of a class. And the candidate is sounding very empathetic and say, yep, I know, to change a pad or something. And then the candidate said, yeah, no, I do understand. And do you smoke? And you can just see how that sort of jars. We then sort of looked at the micro moments across these 40 cases, and actually we didn't see a great deal of difference. So if you look at the top of this table, you'll see a column for the clear fails, the borderline passes, and the clear passes. There isn't a huge difference in exam modelling using the frequent phrases, in alignment, but there is in misalignment, overt misunderstandings, and false starts. I think it was Morecambe and Wise, wasn't it, where they, with that famous sketch with Andrew Previn, where Eric Morecambe is playing the piano rather badly, and he says, I am playing all the right notes, but they're just not necessarily in the right order. And I think this is actually a bit of dialogue that shows how putting it in the right order can actually make a real difference to the listening ear of the examiner, who's looking out for candidates who show empathy and who are building a relationship with their patient. So here we've got somebody who, a patient who's come in because he actually wants medication for joints, but it's medication that isn't currently prescribable, or it's a bit iffy. And he's having a negotiation with the doctor because he really wants this medication, and other people have had it that he knows of. So he's saying, oh, well, it does seem very unreasonable. Whereas, if you cross the road and they say, oh, that's fine. And the candidate is trying to explain to the patient why she's not going to prescribe this. And she does it really nicely. And she said, no, I do know, I really do understand. I think particularly if you've got friends who, and it's just the way in which she does it that seems to make all the difference to the way in which she gets marked, because she's doing the right thing, but the way she does it is what makes it sound so good. And in fact, when you actually start looking at how people are talking in sort of normal parlance, when you are talking to somebody, your voice goes up and down. If you look at the green line at the bottom, your voice goes up and down as you say things. If you're listing something, say symptoms of having liver problems, you say, well, you may develop this symptom and that symptom and the other symptom, and then such and such happens. And as you finish that, your voice goes down at the end, and it indicates to the patient that you've finished. For people who speak another language as their mother tongue, you don't necessarily talk like that. Most of the international medical graduates that we looked at in this study were of a South Asian background, and the way in which word orders are used and the way of speaking is just different to English. You know, it's just as good, it's just different. And when it's then moved into English speech, the information that is given tends to be in short packages with the same melody, so it sounds like a list, but it doesn't end in the way that it would do for somebody who spoke English as their mother tongue. So to somebody who's listening, it sounds uncaring, but in an Indian language, the low pitch is conventionally a marker of respect. And it also affects the way explanations are delivered. And again, it's really interesting how these little differences, that's something that as medical people, we're not trained to think about, can make such a difference. The weight of simulation on overseas trained trainees and candidates is just pretty huge. And Celia likened it to being a fish in water. You're a fish that can swim. You can swim up, down, left, right, like any other fish, but you feel the weight of the water all the time. So we concluded that the differences in performance were only visible on microanalysis, but small differences led to large effects, and that there was a need to explore better ways to assess interpersonal skills in clinical medical examinations. We do feel that it's better done in the workplace and with real patients, if possible. And interestingly, the pandemic forced the exam to change into a recorded clinical assessment using real patients and being double marked and coming from the workplace. So doing all of that. Rather sadly, the differential attainment gap has remained exactly the same. So general implications of this. It's a paradox in institutional life, I think, how to be fair and maintain standards and universal criteria in a really diverse society. Many candidates are seeing very different types of patients, working in very different areas. It's really difficult then if you come in to do a standardized exam, that's an exit exam into the rest of your career. It's a really difficult area to address. What next for the MRCGP? So I've told you about the recorded consultation assessment, 13 recordings this time instead of 13 cases, matched to an assessment blueprint. They were all double marked by 2 examiners to try to improve the reliability of the marking. Did it affect differential attainment? Well, no, it didn't. We're now progressing to design a new module that is meant to be pandemic, weather and train strike proof, if such a thing is possible, and to be more reflective of today's general practice with use of IT, patients with multiple morbidity, wider use of multidisciplinary teams, and so on. But we are also looking at how we're marking these cases to reduce the weight of assessment of interpersonal skills in a simulated setting while testing clinical management more. And it'll be very interesting to see whether or not we make a difference there. So that is the end of my presentation.